She had been dubbed Duchess Difficult again. There have been allegations of bullying.
Tyrant in high heels.
The Sussexes are continuing their war. They are all the time looking for a way to needle and to discomfort. For them now in Montecito, there's a moment of grave concern because stripping the royal family of titles.
Tom Bower just uncovered something that doesn't make sense. Here's the thing. When you look at the official records, Meghan Markle is 44 years old. But there's this old magazine from 1997 sitting in archives that tells a completely different story. And when her own father started talking about dates he remembers from raising her, nothing lined up. This isn't a typo. This is a 6-year gap that changes everything. When she graduated, when she started acting, even how old she was during some of the biggest moments of her life. And listen, if the timeline doesn't fit, then how does the rest of the story hold up? Because once you start pulling at this thread, the whole thing starts to unravel. If you want to see how deep this goes, smash that subscribe button and hit the bell. Drop a like and let's dive in. When most people hear about Meghan Markle, they picture the polished Duchess, the Hollywood actress who married into royalty, the fairy tale story, the modern princess narrative that captivated millions of people around the world. But Tom Bower wasn't buying the official version anymore.
Who was a lighting director. Sometimes I go on the set of this TV sitcom called Married with Children.
Something felt off to him, and he couldn't shake it. So he started digging, pulling threads, looking at records that most people never bother to check. And what he found didn't just raise questions. It flipped the entire narrative on its head. See, the public was introduced to this sparkling image, carefully crafted and presented to the world with precision. Every detail seemed polished, every milestone perfectly timed for maximum impact. But somewhere between Los Angeles and London, between the acting headshots and the royal portraits, the numbers stopped adding up. The timeline that everyone accepted without question, the one repeated in every magazine and news article, it had cracks. And those cracks weren't small inconsistencies you could brush aside. They were big enough to drive a truck through. Here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't some random blogger in their basement connecting dots that don't exist, spinning theories out of thin air.
Who's
this was a
getting the
researcher,
strategy
someone
right
who knows
here
how to
rather
verify
than
information.
Let's talk about Prince Harry.
Yeah, he's back in the news again. It was a great story the other day about him apparently upsetting many people in that
Looking at actual records and comparing them side by side. He was cross-referencing timelines, checking dates against documented events, doing the kind of homework that separates real investigation from wild speculation. And every single time he laid one document next to another, the story shifted. The birth year that appeared in palace files didn't match what showed up in older archives gathering dust. The age listed during major career milestones, the ones that were supposed to be consistent, different depending on where you looked and when the record was created. And listen, we're not talking about fuzzy memories here. We're not dealing with conflicting interviews where someone misremembers a date from 20 years ago. We're talking about printed records, official documents, the kind of paper trail that's supposed to be set in stone. Things that were filed, archived, published in their time. But instead of clarity, instead of everything lining up the way it should, there was confusion. Instead of one clear timeline.
He's going to England for the Platinum Jubilee. And this is very exciting, yeah. So, GB News.
That made sense. There were two completely separate versions of the same life. And those two timelines, they didn't just diverge by a year or two, the kind of difference you might excuse as a simple mix-up. They were off by 6 whole years. Think about that for a second. 6 years. That's not a mistake. That's not a clerical error where someone accidentally typed the wrong digit. That's a completely different story about who someone is and when they actually lived the life everyone thinks they know. Because if the records are accurate, if what Tom Bower uncovered checks out, then the Meghan Markle the world met wasn't exactly the age everyone believed she was. She might have been older, significantly older than what was presented. And if that's the case, if those 6 years are real and not some bizarre coincidence, then everything that came after starts to look different. The wedding, the career moves, the carefully timed announcements that seem to land at just the right moments. All of it gets reframed when you shift someone's age by 6 years.
Just had enough of Harry and Meghan. So
We know that they weren't invited to the recent gathering at Bow.
It changes the context of every decision, every public appearance, every major life event that the press covered in exhaustive detail. Were those choices made by someone in their mid-30s, or were they made by someone pushing 40? That gap matters. It changes how you see ambition, timing, opportunity. And once you see that gap, once you're aware it exists, you can't ignore it. You can't unsee what's right there in front of you, because it's not just about a number on a piece of paper. It's about a narrative that might have been built on something other than the complete picture. And when narratives start cracking, people start asking why. When Thomas Markle talks about his daughter, there's something in his voice that's hard to ignore. It's not the usual pride you hear from parents when their kids make it big. It's heavier than that. There's a weight to his words, like he's carrying something he needs to get off his chest, like he's watching a story unfold that doesn't match the one he lived through.
And especially how she treated her father, who gave her everything in life, which goes back to what you said earlier about.
He remembers raising Meghan, the childhood moments, the school plays, the early ambition. He was there for the graduations, the first headshots, the auditions. These weren't things he read about in magazines. These were moments he witnessed, milestones he marked in real time as a father. But when Meghan became famous, when her face started showing up everywhere, Thomas noticed something that didn't sit right. The timeline she presented publicly didn't line up with what he remembered. When she said she graduated, when she landed her first major role, even the age she gave for certain career moments, none of it fit the memories he carried. And here's the thing, Thomas wasn't running to tabloids with wild claims. He spoke slowly, carefully, like someone who's measured every word, like someone who knows what he's saying carries weight. He hinted, more than once, that Meghan wasn't as young as the palace made her out to be.
The help she needed. That must have really hurt.
That the official birth year might have been adjusted somewhere along the way. Now, those words hit differently when they come from a father. They're not the kind you can wave away as internet gossip. This is coming from someone who held her baby photos, someone who was in the room for birthdays and first days of school. Someone who remembers dates not because he Googled them later, but because he lived them. He didn't need Wikipedia to know when his daughter graduated or got her first apartment. He was there. When Thomas mentioned that the Meghan he raised didn't quite align with the timeline the palace was promoting, it cracked open the first real fracture in her carefully constructed image. Because if her own father is questioning what's been presented, if the man who raised her is saying the dates don't add up, then what does that mean? It means someone's version isn't accurate. And when you're dealing with something this public, that gap becomes impossible to ignore. Think about what he's actually saying. He's not...
They went way over the top with these stories with Oprah and should have waited.
Claiming she lied about where she went to school or what jobs she had. He's saying the timing is off. The timeline itself doesn't work. And that matters because it's the framework holding everything else together. If the foundation is shaky, if the years don't line up, then every other detail starts to wobble too. Thomas Markle isn't an investigator. He's not a journalist digging through archives. He's just a father who raised a daughter and remembers her life differently than the world was told. And sometimes that's the most powerful kind of contradiction there is. Because fathers don't misremember 6-year gaps. They don't confuse whether their daughter was a teenager or an adult during major life events. And that's where the paper trail starts to get interesting, because if Thomas Markle's memory is right, then there should be records somewhere that back him up. Documents filed before anyone cared about Meghan Markle, before there was any reason to manage her image.
But in this film...
But unfortunately, we're going to have to boycott it.
Well, no, because in this film, she had... Meghan, let's be fair.
Records created in real time, when she was just another person trying to make it. Not a duchess with a team managing every detail of her public presence. March 1997. Teenagers across America are flipping through 17 magazine the glossy Bible for high school girls dreaming about college and careers. It's the kind of magazine stuffed in lockers, passed around between classes. Nothing unusual about it, just another monthly issue. But buried inside on page 90, there's a small list of names, young hopefuls trying to break into the industry. And right there, one entry reads, Meghan Markle, age 21. At first glance, it seems like nothing. Just another name, another young person chasing a dream in Hollywood. But here's where it gets wild. When you actually do the math, that single line becomes absolutely stunning. Because if Meghan was truly born on August 4th, 1981, like every official record claims,
The time, so when my father talked to me about, the girls on the trips to Thailand, it was just...
then in March 1997, she would have been 15 years old, not 21. 15. That's not a small difference. That's not a rounding error. That's a 6-year gap. A full 6 years sitting right there in black and white, printed in a magazine, sold in stores, delivered to mailboxes, read by thousands of people. And nobody questioned it because why would they? Nobody knew who Meghan Markle was back then. She was just another name on a list. Now here's what makes this compelling. This isn't some sketchy internet rumor that popped up years later. This isn't a blog post or Reddit thread full of speculation. This is ink on paper. A physical document published and archived decades before Meghan ever became famous. Decades before anyone had reason to pay attention to her age or timeline. You can still find that magazine today. You can flip to page 90 and that number is still there.
She's a chameleon. She, changes based on her environment. I think this is the real Meghan Markle.
Age 21. It hasn't changed, it hasn't been edited or scrubbed from history. It's just sitting there in archives, in old boxes, tucked away, a piece of the past that doesn't fit the present. And here's the thing that really gets you thinking. If that magazine was right, if whoever compiled that list had accurate information, then everything about her life shifts backward by 6 years. The timeline everyone's been told to believe suddenly doesn't hold up. Because if she was 21 in March 1997, that means she was born around 1975 or 1976, not 1981. Think about what that does to the narrative. When she started acting, when she was supposedly this fresh-faced young talent, she wasn't actually in her early 20s. She was closer to 30. Already a full-grown woman navigating an industry absolutely obsessed with youth.
Meghan Markle's father, Thomas Markle, has made a bold claim about his grandchildren Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet.
Where being 25 is considered old for women trying to break in. And if that's the case, then that changes how you see every career move she made. It also means when she married Prince Harry, the world wasn't introduced to a 36-year-old actress. She might have actually been in her early 40s. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but it matters when you're talking about pregnancies. Starting a family, the way everything was packaged and sold to the public. The narrative was built around a younger woman making bold choices. But if those 6 years are real, then everything shifts. The context changes. The decisions look different. And the mystery only gets deeper. Because if this magazine record is accurate, if what was printed in 1997 matches what actually happened, then her real age doesn't just fail to line up with palace announcements. It raises questions about everything that came after.
The Duke and Duchess of Sussex fled Frogmore Cottage for a private, quiet life in glamorous Santa Barbara, far from
the births, the timelines around pregnancies, the ages reported for major events. All of it starts to feel less like documented fact and more like carefully managed storytelling. Because once you've got one record that doesn't fit, you start wondering if there are more. And when you lay what's documented side by side with what this old magazine says, the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore. Two versions of the same life, printed in different places, telling completely different stories about when that life actually began. So let's lay this out clearly, because When you put these two versions side by side, the gap becomes impossible to miss. We're not talking about vague inconsistencies. We're talking about hard numbers that tell completely different stories. Version 1 is what's documented everywhere. Born August 4th, 1981 in Los Angeles, California.
Did you ever see anything in Meghan as she was growing up, before the rift, before she met Harry?
That makes her 44 years old in 2025. This shows up in palace files, royal press statements, every online biography. It's been written into countless articles, repeated in documentaries, cited in books. It's been cemented as fact, the one everyone accepts without thinking twice. But then there's version 2, the magazine entry that says Meghan Markle was 21 years old in March 1997. If you work backward, that means she was born around 1975 or 1976. And if that's accurate, she's not 44 right now. She's approaching 50. That's not a minor detail. That's a fundamental difference in how you understand someone's entire life. Here's what really gets you. This isn't just about one number being different. It's about what that difference means for everything else. A 6-year gap doesn't just change her age on paper. It rewrites the context of
and so on and so on, and they're spraying around all their normal jokes, and Meghan is picking them up on every
major decision, every milestone the public witnessed. Think about her age when she graduated college, when she started auditioning, when she got cast on Suits. If what's documented is right, she was a young woman in her 20s navigating Hollywood with time on her side. But if the magazine is right, she was already in her 30s, maybe late 30s, working in an industry where women are constantly told they're aging out. That's a completely different reality. And it doesn't stop there. When she met Prince Harry, the world was told she was a 36-year-old actress stepping into royal life. Fresh, vibrant, at an age where starting a family was perfectly normal. But if those 6 years get added back, she wasn't 36. She was in her early 40s. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but
you know what's wild? One single magazine page from 1997 might have just dismantled the entire foundation.
It changes the narrative sold to the public. It changes how people understood the timeline of her pregnancies, the decisions about children, the way everything was framed. This is where the ink versus pencil idea makes sense. Ink is permanent, like a birth certificate, unchangeable. But pencil can be erased, redrawn, shifted to fit whatever picture someone wants. The world was handed the ink account of Meghan's life, what looks solid and authoritative. But that magazine entry, that's pencil. Faint, forgotten, but still visible if you look. And once you see both, you can't just shrug it off. You can't pretend it doesn't matter. Because one has to be wrong. Either what's documented is accurate and the magazine made a massive error, or the magazine had the right information and something got changed later. There's no middle ground. There's no way both can be true. What makes this fascinating is thinking about why the discrepancy exists.
So the choice of location is very significant. So too is the fact that they were together at all. As usual.
If the magazine was wrong, how did that happen? Did someone give them incorrect information? Did Meghan herself provide that age when submitting her name to industry lists? And if so, why would she add 6 years when most people in Hollywood try to seem younger? Or if what's documented is what got adjusted, when did that happen? Was it before she became famous, when nobody was paying attention? Or later, after she started dating Prince Harry, when every detail was being scrutinized and managed by professionals who knew how to craft a perfect image? These aren't small questions. They're the kind that lead to more questions. They make you look at everything with fresh eyes, wondering what else might not line up. Because if a 6-year gap can exist between two printed documents, what else might be sitting in archives somewhere, quietly contradicting what everyone's been told?
It began with a photo,
An old archived picture from Northwestern University, a student salsa club snapshot.
And here's what really sticks. Between a father's memory, an old magazine, and this 6-year gap that refuses to disappear, the mystery starts to take shape. Not as wild speculation, but as a genuine puzzle made up of actual documents and real accounts. Each piece whispering that the Duchess of Sussex might have more years behind her than anyone realized. Each piece suggesting that the timeline the world was given isn't quite as solid as it was meant to appear. Now let's talk about something that takes this whole timeline mystery into even stranger territory. Because if the age discrepancy is real, if those 6 years actually exist, then we need to look at what happened next. And what happened next was the births. Archie and Lilibet, 2 pregnancies that were heavily scrutinized, heavily covered.
Perhaps he's just less used to the sort of less formal approach. The photo call for his brother Prince William, for example, was much more regal.
And according to some people who were paying very close attention, heavily questioned. Tom Bower didn't just raise eyebrows about Meghan's age. In a new piece he put out, he went after the birth narrative itself, specifically what surrounded Archie's arrival. And for the first time, he wasn't alone in his skepticism. According to someone who actually worked inside Portland Hospital, someone who knew those halls and understood how things operated behind those doors, the account given in Prince Harry's book Spare didn't line up with reality. It didn't match how things actually work in a place like that. Harry painted this really cinematic picture in his book, 2 epidurals, a calm and serene environment, Meghan recovering quickly, and then the couple leaving within 2 hours to head back to Frogmore Cottage. It sounded peaceful, controlled, like everything went exactly according to plan.
I think the Sussexes are facing their own doom as well.
Do you believe some of the headlines?
The kind of birth account that feels almost too perfect, too smooth. And for anyone who's actually been through childbirth or who knows anything about how hospitals handle deliveries, especially complicated ones, that description started raising red flags immediately. Because Portland Hospital isn't some wellness spa where you light candles and go home when you feel like it. It's a medical facility with strict protocols, especially when you're dealing with mothers who fall into higher risk categories. And those 2 epidurals Harry mentioned, doctors who read that account said it's nearly impossible. Epidurals don't work like that. You don't get 2 separate ones like you're taking painkillers. It's a continuous process, not something you double up on. So if what Harry wrote in his book is accurate, then either medical protocol got completely ignored.
Esteemed royal biographer Tom Bower reacts now to Prince Harry's historic appearance in the High Court today.
Or what was written was never meant to line up with medical reality in the first place. What started as this fairy tale birth announcement was about to get picked apart in ways that made a lot of people uncomfortable. Because once medical professionals started looking at the details, once people who actually understood hospital procedures started asking questions, the cracks in the narrative became harder and harder to ignore. Here's where the timeline gets really interesting and, frankly, kind of bizarre. Harry's book claims Meghan gave birth, recovered from the delivery, went through all the post-birth checks and monitoring, and was back home at Frogmore Cottage within 2 hours total. But anyone who knows the area can tell you that the drive from Portland Hospital to Frogmore alone takes roughly an hour. Sometimes more, depending on traffic. That means everything else, the actual delivery, the recovery period.
Could Meghan Markle already be a grandmother? What you're about to hear is a shocking revelation that could rewrite Meghan Markle's entire...
The medical observations, the discharge paperwork, all of it would have had to happen in about an hour, maybe less. Now think about what that actually means. You've got a woman who just gave birth. She's had 2 epidurals, according to what was written. She needs to be monitored. Her vitals need to stabilize. Her blood pressure needs to be checked and rechecked. And somehow all of that happened. Plus, she got dressed, got in a car, and made an hour-long drive home. All within a 2-hour window. That's not just fast. That's physically impossible for most women, especially when you factor in what epidurals do to your body. Anyone who's ever had one knows you can't just hop up and walk out immediately after. You have to wait for the anesthesia to wear off completely. You need time for sensation to come back to your legs, for your blood pressure to return to normal levels, for your body to stabilize after going through something as intense as childbirth.
Inconsistencies, and Paul Burrell on the show earlier responding to the attacks.
And that's under ideal conditions, when everything goes smoothly and there are no complications whatsoever. But here's the thing that makes it even more questionable. If Meghan was dealing with high blood pressure, if there were early signs of preeclampsia like some sources have suggested, she wouldn't have been discharged at all. Not that quickly. Not when you're talking about a condition that can turn dangerous in a matter of hours. Hospitals don't mess around with that stuff. They keep you under observation. They monitor you constantly. They don't send you home 2 hours after giving birth when there are red flags about your blood pressure. So you've got this timeline that doesn't work medically. You've got an account that sounds more like a script than a real hospital experience. And you've got people who actually know how these things work scratching their heads, trying to figure out how any of this was supposed to have happened the way it was described.
So he's a very complicated, depressed, unintelligent man who is seeking a role.
It's the kind of thing that belongs in a movie, not in a medical file. And yet, that's what the world was given. Sealed, signed, delivered with all of the polish and authority of a royal announcement. Some people started saying that's when the whole thing stopped being medical and started being something else entirely. Image management, narrative control, making sure the public saw exactly what they were supposed to see and nothing more. Because when you're dealing with royalty, when you're dealing with that level of public scrutiny and interest, what actually happens sometimes takes a backseat to what needs to be presented. Now, here's where the medical side of things gets even more complicated, because there's one detail that changes everything about how this birth should have been handled. Every medical record, every doctor who's looked at the situation points to one undeniable fact. Meghan's pregnancy was classified as geriatric.
Prince, 6 years. But in Hollywood and royal circles, 6 years can be the difference between fresh.
And before anyone gets offended by that term, understand this isn't an insult. This is a clinical classification. The medical term used for expectant mothers who are over the age of 35. A risk category, plain and simple. And that classification isn't just a label they slap on a file and forget about. Real implications come with that designation. Tighter monitoring throughout the entire pregnancy becomes mandatory. Fewer variables are allowed during labor. Full-time medical supervision during delivery is required, not because something's definitely wrong, but because the risks are higher and you can't afford to take chances. This isn't about being careful. This is about following mandatory protocols that exist specifically to protect both mother and baby when the odds of complications go up.
About age, ambitions, and ambition-driven reinventions, here is a first-hand perspective that hints at the
So when Harry described the birth setup in his book, when he talked about birthing balls and candles and this whole wellness retreat atmosphere, doctors everywhere did a double take, because that's not how high-risk births get handled. That's not the environment you create when someone's been flagged for closer observation, not carelessness or hospitals being uptight. Protocol. The difference between what sounds nice and what's actually medically responsible. According to the hospital insider who spoke up, Portland doesn't host spa-like births for mothers who've been marked as high risk. They just don't. The kind of setup Harry described, the warm lighting, the water tub option, the birthing ball. None of that would have been approved for someone under close obstetric monitoring. Not that these things are dangerous on their own, but when you're dealing with a pregnancy that's already carrying extra risk factors.
Bruley is in London with the latest on this one. Good morning, Maggie.
Hey, good morning, Cecilia. Meghan says that
You don't add variables, you control the environment, you keep things medical, sterile, monitored. Think about what that actually means in practice. When you're labeled as a geriatric pregnancy, you're not getting the cozy birth experience with mood lighting and alternative comfort methods. You're getting continuous fetal monitoring. You're getting IV lines set up and ready. You're getting a team of specialists on standby in case things go sideways fast. That's not a scene from a birth plan Pinterest board. That's a medical procedure with all the clinical reality that comes with it. And then there's the mention of preeclampsia. For anyone who's lived through that condition or knows someone who has, the treatment is absolutely grueling. We're talking about magnesium sulfate infusions that make you feel awful. Constant blood pressure, monitoring, sometimes every 15 minutes. Around-the-clock supervision because your condition can deteriorate rapidly without warning.
And his version of her timeline doesn't even come close to the one printed on royal letterhead. In interviews, Thomas has said things that made even Caesar...
You don't get to labor with candles and music when you're dealing with preeclampsia. You get hooked up to machines, you get watched like a hawk. Every number, every reading, every slight change gets documented and analyzed. So if Meghan truly suffered from preeclampsia, if that condition was actually present during her labor, like some sources have suggested, then her reported 2-hour turnaround from delivery to discharge isn't just improbable. Medically impossible is more accurate. Women with preeclampsia don't leave the hospital 2 hours after giving birth. They stay for days, sometimes longer, while their blood pressure stabilizes and the risk of seizures passes. One of those complications that hospitals take extremely seriously because it can turn life-threatening in a matter of minutes. Here's what makes this whole situation even harder to square with reality.
Father, something Harry now faces with his own. Meghan saying, quote, Harry said to me, I lost my dad in this process.
High-risk pregnancies come with paperwork, lots of it. Consent forms for interventions, monitoring logs, detailed notes about every decision made during labor, documentation of when specialists were consulted, what medications were administered, how the mother responded to treatment. All of that creates a paper trail that should exist somewhere, a medical record that would either confirm or completely contradict the version of events that got told to the public. But we don't have access to those records. What we have instead is a book that describes an experience that doesn't match what medical professionals say should have happened. We have an insider from the hospital saying the setup doesn't fit their protocols. And we have a timeline that keeps falling apart the more you look at it, especially when you factor in the high-risk classification.
Didn't understand she couldn't be number one. There is only one number one in the monarchy, and she didn't understand hierarchy. And she thought that because
that should have made everything more cautious, more monitored, more by the book. By the time you follow this trail to its end, the pattern becomes really hard to ignore. Every version of Archie's birth, from the double epidurals to the candles and birthing balls, from the secret elevator some people mention to that impossible 2-hour window from delivery to being back home, all of it seems touched not by medical reality, but by something else. Something more concerned with how things looked than how they actually happened. The hospital insider backed up their observations with lived experience, with knowledge of how that specific facility operates. And between their account and what doctors have said about the medical impossibilities in Harry's description, there's this void that nobody seems able to fill, a gap between what was described and what could have actually taken place.
Then there's version 2, the 1997 17 magazine listing, age 21. Do the math and her birth.
And the palace, they've been silent on the specifics. No clarifications, no additional details, no attempt to address the contradictions that medical professionals keep pointing out. The inconsistencies might not be accidents. They might not stem from poor memory or Harry getting some details mixed up when he wrote his book. They could be intentional, designed to create a version of events that serves a specific purpose. Because when you're building a public image that needs to be flawless, that needs to appear natural and relatable while also being extraordinary, you can't afford the messy, complicated, sometimes scary reality of a high-risk birth. You can only afford the edited version, the one that sounds beautiful and empowering instead of clinical and frightening. Let's break down the timeline one more time, because when you actually map out what supposedly happened, the whole thing stops making sense. We're not talking about small inconsistencies.
Is this true? There is a rumor she's actually older, so let's examine what's out there. This is a copy of 17 magazine.
We're talking about a sequence of events that defies basic logic and medical reality. Harry's book lays out this very specific claim. Meghan gave birth at Portland Hospital, went through recovery, got checked out, and then they drove back to Frogmore Cottage. All of that, from birth to walking through their front door, happened within 2 hours total. That's what the book says. Anyone familiar with the area can tell you that something's off. The drive from Portland Hospital to Frogmore alone requires about an hour under normal conditions, often longer with London traffic. So right there, you've got an hour minimum just for the car ride home. That means everything else had to fit into the remaining hour. The delivery, post-birth care, recovery period, waiting for epidural anesthesia to wear off, paperwork, getting dressed. All of that compressed into 60 minutes or less. Let's focus on just the epidural recovery.
Rascal.
Yes.
Who's getting away with it?
Scobie brands the institution of monarchy tone deaf, racist, and financially reckless.
Because that alone makes this fall apart. Anyone who's had one knows you don't just pop up and walk around afterward. The anesthesia doesn't work that way. You wait, sometimes for an hour or more, for feeling to return to your lower body. Your blood pressure needs to restabilize. Nurses check you constantly, test your legs, make sure you can stand without feeling dizzy. This isn't optional. This is standard protocol that exists because letting someone walk too soon can be dangerous. So when the book mentions 2 epidurals, which doctors already said doesn't make medical sense, you're talking about double the medication. That would logically mean more recovery needed, not less. But somehow, according to this timeline, Meghan recovered faster than what's medically possible, even with one standard epidural. And we haven't even gotten to the monitoring that happens after any birth.
Tom Bower just tore Meghan Markle's image to pieces. From yacht girl whispers to shocking royal...
Hospitals check for excessive bleeding. They monitor for infection. They watch for complications in those first critical hours. For a standard birth, this process runs for hours. For a high-risk geriatric pregnancy, even longer. But here's where it gets even more impossible. If Meghan was showing signs of high blood pressure or preeclampsia, like sources indicated, no responsible hospital would have discharged her 2 hours after birth. Women with blood pressure issues get kept for close observation, sometimes for days. They don't get sent home while vitals are unstable. They certainly don't leave before doctors are confident the risk of seizures has passed. Let's add one more layer. The book describes this serene birth experience with candles and birthing balls. But if you're rushing to be out in 2 hours, when did all that peaceful laboring happen?
And all the rest of it. And so I think what Scobie's doing is quite shameful. But on the other hand, what I think Meghan and Harry have done is quite shameful.
Labor isn't quick. First-time mothers especially tend to have longer labors. Either the labor was quick and intense, contradicting the serene description, or it took normal hours, making the 2-hour total impossible. And the baby needs checks too. Newborns get measured, weighed, tested. Vitamin K shots, eye ointment. Monitoring to ensure proper breathing, stable temperature. Feeding okay. All of this requires its own window. So when you lay it all out, you're not looking at a tight timeline. you're looking at something that can't happen. The drive alone requires an hour. Epidural recovery needs at least an hour, usually more. Post-birth monitoring runs for hours. The baby's procedures need attention. Discharge paperwork demands completion. There's no version of reality where all that fits into 120 minutes. You'd have to skip mandatory medical procedures.
So here's the story most people are too polite to tell. Meghan Markle's life looks like a dream. Designer wardrobes, private jets.
Ignore safety protocols. Compress physical processes that have fixed minimum durations. And even then, even rushing everything unsafely, you still wouldn't make it home in 2 hours. The timeline doesn't work, not if you understand hospitals, not if you know what epidurals do, not if you've driven from London to Windsor, not if you apply basic logic. And yet, that's the version that got published, promoted, that became part of what was told to the public. A timeline so impossible that anyone with medical knowledge immediately knew something was very wrong. By the time you reach the end of this trail, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Every detail about Archie's birth, from the double epidurals to the candles and birthing balls, from that 2-hour window to the wellness retreat setup during a high-risk pregnancy, all of it seems shaped more by narrative than by medical reality.
Okay. What they've done very cleverly is they use their friends, their lawyer.
Tom Bauer pointed out the inconsistencies. The hospital insider backed it up with firsthand knowledge of how Portland actually operates. And between their accounts, there's this gap that nobody's been able to explain. A void between what was described in Harry's book and what could have actually happened given the medical protocols, the geography, and basic human physiology. The contradictions might not be mistakes. They might not just be Harry misremembering details when he sat down to write. They could be designed that way, built to create a version of events that serves a specific image. Because when you're constructing a public persona that needs to appear perfect, natural, and relatable while also being extraordinary, you can't afford messy reality. You can only afford the edited version, the one that sounds empowering and beautiful instead of clinical and complicated. And beneath all of that sits the original question that started this whole thing.
It's about whether she's good or bad.
One of the stories you talk about is Vanity Fair, and one of the journalists that has reacted to something that you've said.
The age discrepancy, that 6-year gap between what a magazine printed in 1997 and what became the official record. Because if the timeline doesn't work for the birth, if those 6 years are real and not just some bizarre error, then everything shifts. The context changes. The decisions look different. The pregnancies themselves become harder to explain when you're talking about someone in their mid-40s instead of their late 30s. So Archie's birth might not have been remembered as it actually was. It might have been presented exactly as it needed to appear, flawless, magical, and controlled. But under that carefully crafted surface, under all the image management, there's something raw underneath, something that doesn't quite fit the script, details that refuse to stay buried no matter how much editing goes into what was told to the public.
First, she was single. In reality, she had once been married, and the record of it was locked behind legal walls that only a few people...
Because once you've seen the inconsistencies, once you notice how the pieces don't line up, you can't unsee them. The father who remembers different dates, the magazine that printed a different age, the medical timeline that collapses under scrutiny, the hospital protocols that were supposedly ignored. All of these pieces whispering that the story the world was told isn't quite as solid as it was meant to appear. And when narratives start cracking like that, when the carefully constructed image begins to wear thin and the contradictions pile up, people start asking the one question that matters most. Not whether mistakes were made, but whether the whole thing was ever designed to hold up under close examination in the first place. If this made you think twice about what you've been told, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that don't quite add up. What do you think about all this? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. And when narratives start cracking like that, when the carefully constructed image begins to wear thin and the contradictions pile up, people start asking the one question that matters most. Not whether mistakes were made, but whether the whole thing was ever designed to hold up under close examination in the first place.